Hello, great morning, great afternoon, great evening, wherever this conversation finds you. I am Travis Gray. Today we are transforming with our guest, Gregg Levoy. He is the author of This Business of Writing, Callings, Finding and Following an Authentic Life, one of the top career publications on the market. I actually had this as a mandatory read for a class in my master's program. So great book. Really enjoy it. And Vital Signs, Discovering and Sustaining Your Passion for Life. Gregg has written for New York Times, Digest, Washington Post, and more. He is a speaker and leader. Gregg, I met him at the Center for Spiritual Living. He facilitated a really beautiful workshop that allowed me to break through some of the limiting beliefs and stories and narratives. And as Gregg and I were talking, we talked about how our libraries are probably mirroring one another. And I'm really excited for this conversation. Gregg, how are you?
Terrific. Thanks so much for having me on the show.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So, Gregg, right away, I'm interested in your professional journey. Like, how did you begin as a journalist? How did you get into? At some point, the trajectory landed you into this like transcendent spiritual realm of things at the Center for Spiritual Living and things. But your books are very practical in the career and callings in some ways. So how did you begin your professional career?
Wow, that's a great question. Great big question.
Yeah.
I would say one of the primary things that I go to in my mind when you ask that question is that ever since I can remember, and my parents confirmed this, I have had a very high level of curiosity about life.
Yeah.
Just curiosity is like my superpower.
Yeah.
And that led me naturally into a career in journalism. Although I kind of majored in changing majors before I landed in journalism, I tried out a lot of different things, including psych and English and anthropology and archaeology. But the curiosity was the foundational piece for me. And I've been doing that since I was little. But I also ran across an Italian writer some years ago. I think I mentioned him in one of the books, named Alberto Moravia. And he said that he thought it was important in life to pursue the one problem you were born to understand.
Mm.
And that really grabbed me because I think one of mine has been, how do you create a life that truly belongs to you and isn't a knockoff, isn't a hand-me-down, isn't a pale echo of somebody else's agenda or somebody else's calling?
Yeah.
And that really led to some of the practical aspects of how do you do that?
Mm-hmm.
Starting with turning on the receivers.
Yeah.
Which is
what was that one thing for you?
Yeah, the one problem I was born to understand is, how do you create an authentic life?
Mm.
Now, part of that is a reflection of the fact that I come from a family business that stretched back to pretty much the 1800s.
Yeah.
And all the men in my family went into that business for generations, except me and my two brothers. Yeah. And so I have this thought that's why I use the term hand-me-down life. The table was set for me before I even got to the table, and that didn't work for me.
Yeah. What kind of business was that?
It's a company that actually still exists, though it's not in my family anymore. It's called Tura, Tura. It's a designer eyewear firm in New York.
Okay, cool. And so you are you're exploring this question through your life. You're exploring this question, and at the beginning of your journey, how to create this authentic life. I understand that at the in our last meeting, we had you had spoken about having a twin brother, and that seems very much aligned with that. Well, how?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Because part of the task for us, for my brother Ross and I, was to individuate.
Right.
I think the task of most kids is to learn how to bond.
Yeah.
But for twins, there's the additional piece of learning how to separate.
Sure.
And so that also feeds into the idea of creating a life for yourself that really belongs to you. And so being a twin was just an extra incentive to separate and create my own identity. One of the first questions you're always asked as a twin is, which half are you? Which really kind of gets under gets under your skin after a while. It's like, I'm actually not half of anything. I'm a whole. Right. And it's just for other people's convenience that I have to field that question all the time. Mm-hmm. So that fed into it as well.
Yeah. So your authentic life led you into journalism, exploring this question, how to create an authentic life. And then you created some wonderful books for others and how they can find and follow through with their callings and things like this. So in the beginning of your journalism career, where did you end up? How did that develop? How did you continue to do more work in the journalism and in writing?
Yeah, well, I took my senior year in college and I became an intern. That was my senior year. I worked on Writer's Digest magazine in Cincinnati, Ohio, which is the professional journal for writers and artists. Awesome. And so I got into the publishing world at ground level. And that eventually led to a job at the Cincinnati Enquirer. I pitched myself to them as a freelancer for about a year, and then they had a job opening and they hired me. Mm-hmm. But they hired me, and this is how I pitched myself to them and got the job, I think. I pitched myself to be their a singles columnist. Okay, yeah. I figured I had the I had the nose for news. I was single, and I had that superpower of curiosity. So I was really a natural reporter. But I pitched myself to them, and they hired me to be a singles columnist. Yeah. And at the time, this would be the mid 70s. There was only one other paper in the country that had a singles column. It was the Philadelphia Inquirer. And so I did that for 5 years, and then they let me turn it into a self column. Yeah. And then I went to work for another one of the papers under the Gannett umbrella, which was USA Today, as their behavioral reporter. So I just kind of amped it up over the years, but psychology was always my beat. Human behavior was my beat. I wanted to know how people ticked. Yeah. And the deep underlying motivations, really the kind of stuff I guess Sophia University specializes in.
Absolutely. That's why your book came onto the register and been a required reading callings for transpersonal psychology. It's for transpersonal psychology, they have a funny way of being. It can get too spiritual, I would say. You know, some people and some interested professionals can be on the too spiritual side of things. But then psychologists, a lot of the mainstream behaviorist psychotherapies and psychology programs around the country are a little too material, a little too behaviorist, a little too practical, but somewhere in that middle area, that I think that's really the soul of transpersonal psychology, the intent, the farther reaches of human nature, but to make the spiritual practical, the Eastern wisdom, the Eastern philosophy, and the Western science, bringing those two pieces together. And that sort of inner call to that is coming from God, or that is coming from your soul needing to be expressed in some manner, that coming from the inside, that's an important aspect to make practical in your life. That's an important thing to, you know, how does that calling become my profession? How does that calling become the way that I'm interacting in my relationships and things like this?
Yeah, you know what I've discovered though for myself about spiritual work is, and this is from somebody who essentially had an agnostic upbringing. Okay, so neither confirm nor deny. Yeah. Not quite as far as atheists, but somewhere up on that spectrum. So I have discovered for myself that spiritual work is just the work of creating a connection with whatever is greater than me. Okay, so that's the natural world. Yeah. That's community. that's partnership.
Yeah.
Okay. Or just my own potential. So I kind of look at spiritual work that way rather than an up and out rise above theologies or any of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And I discovered recently that um, if, to whatever degree I can stomach labels, that I am what's called a religious naturalist.
Mm.
I just discovered this. This is Thoreau and Emerson and even Einstein, people like that to some degree. All the nature poets to some degree. These are people who find what other people refer to as God in the natural world.
Mm-hmm.
So reverence and grace and source and awe and, that kind of thing. I find it out in the natural world. And somehow I was really pleased to actually have a way to describe myself because I do a lot of gigs in faith-based organizations and churches and whatnot. And people are often asking me, what's your faith? So I feel like I have a more solid response to that question than I ever have, rather than, well, I'm an agnostic.
Yeah. I grew up kind of questioning the upbringing of my religious experience, and agnostic fit me for a while. I think I identified as agnostic for a while. Just the questioning. I don't know. I'm curious about it. I'm curious about what the truth is, that spiritual truth. But I'm still growing and exploring that. And then I came across the Sanskrit Tattvam Asi.
Okay.
Tattvam Asi, thou art that. So
Mm.
you are that thing. That thing is us, vice versa. That it is living, breathing through us, and that seems like the most aligned truth for
myself. And I think that's partly what callings are about, is pointing us in the direction of that. That essential truth. I think that's a big part of what they're about. And I'm always encouraging people to try to access their callings in the little daily calls, not the great big burning bush stuff. Some people, not many, I think, get their calls in that way. A voice from on high, that kind of thing. But the little tiny daily calls. So that's why I talked about turning on the receivers and just starting to train your ear to what forms calls come in. I ran across a wonderful writer. What's her name? Novelist. I'm blanking out on her name actually, but she's brilliant at describing the dynamics between couples. And she says, I can always tell what my husband is really thinking by the tunes that he absentmindedly hums in the car. And I loved when I read that. I said, that's a calling. And that's the level at which I always encourage people to think of this stuff, is that what are the song lyrics that get stuck in your head for a week or two? There's something to that. What section of the bookstore do you always go into when you walk into a bookstore? That's the level at which I think it's important to try to discern calls, the little daily things like that.
That's a beautiful way for her to have put it. The hums of her husband.
Right.
That's great.
Right. Which means it's important for guys to be aware of this, because I'm in the mood for love is really different than tied to the whipping post. So being aware of that.
The phenomenology. I'm doing my dissertation work right now using a phenomenological inquiry, and that word phenomenology is the study of phenomena. Phenomena are the things that shine forth in your lived experience. So that is what I have aligned with, is what is shining forth to you right now. Sometimes it's I've been lucky to have a relationship with a woman that shined forth to me in the way that she smiled and interacted with others. And in that moment of her shining forth, I did not shy away from that shining forth. I moved towards it, and that led into the opportunity to create the relationship and grow and develop those things. So those synchronicities, or in The Alchemist, they'd be called omens, or those things, those little twinkles in the universe. If you can be aware to see those twinkles happen, those little stars shining forth to you, and move towards those things, I think you're your life will be really great. We have a
Yeah.
lot of this neurotic. Abraham Maslow spoke about the neuroses of personal growth, in that we and our resistance to those things. And lately, and in my research, I like the resistance. I had mentioned right before we started here that in the book Callings, I had this chapter bookmarked, and you wrote about Jonah complex, which I had also written about in my dissertation. So this Jonah syndrome, what could you tell people about their resistances, and about their overcoming of those resistances to the call,
Mm.
or leaning into things?
Yeah. I love, by the way, your idea of the twinkles and the things that you are drawn toward and the things that you are drawn away from, to
Sure.
really start to become sensitive to what those are. What are you moved toward?
Yeah.
You know, what kind of tropisms do you have? Like the way plants lean toward the sun. What are those things in your life? And what are the things you,
towards the sun? Yeah.
yeah, I mean, that kind of energy happens to us for soul work and spirit work and people in our lives, and where we're going to express our gifts. There are things we lean toward and away from. And just as, you know, I made a list years ago. I sat down and I made a list of activities that I was involved in my life at that point that were draining my energies rather than replenishing them. And, you know, everything from letting my bosses at the newspaper assign me stories instead of coming up with my own, to driving in rush hour traffic when I didn't need to be, or doing my own taxes, or watching TV, or letting myself get trapped into conversations with talkaholics. You know, so it was just a list of activities just so I could be more aware of the things that I was doing in my life that were draining me rather than giving me energy. So that's something. But the resistance piece, you know, one of my heroes is Joseph Campbell, who gave us the hero's journey. And he said, phase one of responding to a calling is running from it. So I say that, you know, by way of compassion for yourself. If you find yourself resisting a call, natural, inevitable, universal.
Yeah.
And it's just important to remember that that's part of the path. It's not opposed to it. It's like meditation practice. You sit down, you want the perfect meditation, which to me includes quiet on the set. Yeah. But then the two dogs next door start barking, and I get pissed off because it's interrupting the meditation. And my meditation teachers are saying, no, that is the meditation. So the resistance is part of the meditation, is part of the call, and dive into it, you know, drill there rather than cursing and muttering about the indignity of it all. Right. or telling yourself a story like it's not a true call of resistance shows up.
Yeah. That urge to run, those emotions that are excited as a result of hearing the call and hearing maybe how powerful it is, and what a great opportunity you have to have had this idea, the muse to have dropped this idea, this mission into your life. That the anxiety, all of that comes up for that is natural. It's a natural piece of the process. And I do love I facilitate a lot of meditation, and I do love the idea that you can meditate in very busy places, and that is where you are lifting the most weight. That's where it's heavy weight when you're, you know, in a busy train station or something trying to meditate.
Yeah, I saw a guy when I was a teenager do that in the lunchroom lodge of a ski area. Yeah. And I don't know if you've ever been in one of these, but everyone's wearing ski boots and it's just cacophonous. Yeah. And he just dropped into this really peaceful meditation. And I knew it was authentic because his mouth dropped open, and nobody would voluntarily do that in public because it makes people look silly or something. But I was so impressed at his ability to lift that kind of weight in a ski lodge.
Yeah, I absolutely. I've been snowboarding only one time, one weekend, a Saturday and a Sunday in Tahoe, and it was amazing. And I do know how loud those places can go, but what a beautiful moment that it is to give yourself to be in just a place of calm. And I think that when you are having an experience of transcendence in that way, you're transcending the sound, the space, the moment. You're transcending to be in this meditative state. I think that that fuels you so that you can move towards your calling even
Oh,
further. Like
mm,
you could take a moment to yourself to build a maybe a better relationship, have a different relationship or a better relationship to those feelings of angst around it, calm those things, be with those things, and then move out of the meditation to be fueled, to continue to move towards the calling.
yeah. I remember somebody once telling me that I needed to learn how to suffer creatively and not just neurotically.
Yeah, yeah.
Was very amusing and terrifying to me. But suffering creatively to me means when anything comes up, resistance or even joy or anything, write about it. Okay. Or go sit down at the piano and compose a piece based on that emotional state.
Mhm.
But process it in some way, use it, plow it in, and use it to grow something rather than suffering neurotically, which I sort of understand as the split between my essential self and my socialized self.
Mhm.
That's kind of my rudimentary understanding of neurosis. Is we have an essential, almost instinctive self, and then we have the conditioned self.
Mhm.
And when they butt heads like this, that's often where there's neurotic behavior. And I'm looking for that and trying to flush it out.
Yeah.
And one of the ways, go ahead.
Right now, and I think my audience here is going to be a lot of transpersonal students, and some of them are in dissertation right now and working on these, great academic works, and suffering neurotically is unfortunately some moments and pieces of the process. I've definitely suffered neurotically a lot
Oh God.
during my dissertation process, but suffering creatively, you using that, transmuting that energy to be to be your expressive juice, to have an outlet, and do
Yeah.
something good for yourself instead of sitting in the turmoil and spinning
Right.
in.
Although there's something to be said for sitting in turmoil.
Hmm.
I think our tendency is to want to fix. I want to fix out of
Mhm.
turmoil, out of discomfort, out of fear. And so we look for fixes. And of course, there's, all the options that we have in this culture.
Yeah.
What does somebody call it? Weapons of mass distraction.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. But
and
my teacher called them weapons of mass distraction. Yeah.
yeah. And but there's something to be said for just training myself to sit with the discomfort
Yeah.
and see where it shows up in the body and how it moves. It's not a static thing. It's very fluid, and seeing what words and associations and images, what writing I can draw out of it. But there's something about not wanting to run from it.
Yeah.
I don't know if I mentioned this in the class that we did at CSL, but the only book I have ever read 5 times
Mm.
is a book called Transitions by William Bridges.
Mhm.
I don't know if you've run across this book, but it's a book about how people make change. And he
Mhm.
says it happens in 3 phases.
Mhm.
Phase one is something ending.
Mhm.
Phase three is something beginning. And the reason I've gone back to that book at 5 turning transition points in my life is because of the middle section. He calls it the neutral zone.
Mhm.
And, it's a stinker
Yeah.
because it means the I don't know phase, the sitting with the turmoil and the disruption and the uncertainty. And he just makes a beautiful case for why it is so important to gently submit yourself to a neutral zone and not get a fix.
Yeah. Yeah. That is great. Have you ever sat in a cold tub, uh, like a ice bath?
No.
We have an instinctive get away from this cold water. But if
Yes.
you would sit in there, I just recently, I've known about the power of this. I've done cold showers. I even had this little experiment, a phenomenological inquiry about what was shining forth to people, as they the angst that was shining forth to people as they went to turn the knob to cold water, knowing that they were going to go into a cold bath. I had a really good friend of mine that was involved in the experiment, and he lied to me. And then he confessed to his lie. He's like, "Oh, you're my best friend. I don't want to lie to you." But he lied to me. And then at the same time, he was able to go into the cold San Francisco Bay water to surf. So it's like, it's interesting, different relationship to that cold water. But recently, I had the opportunity to go to Carmel. And Carmel has a retreat center that I recommend you give it a shot, Greg, is called Refuge. Refuge, you could book a massage, but you don't have to. And then mostly what this Refuge is that there are saunas, steam rooms, hot tubs, and cool and cold plunges. And so my first experience going there, I was there for 4 hours just making these rotations.
Wow.
And a couple of times, those initial times into the cold water, my partner and I, who I was with, was very quick to get out of the cold water. But I wanted to, dive in. I was curious about the depths that I would get to by staying in that cold water. Maybe the third or fourth time that we go into the cold plunge, I had a magical moment for just being in that cold water, letting myself, shiver. Like these electric shivers would run through my body, and it felt healing. And it is something to do with sitting in that neutral zone. In that meditative space, in that neutral zone. And there's a visceral experience, a psychosomatic experience by doing that in cold water. It's really amazing.
And so I'm curious, how did it feel healing?
It felt healing. I think it was like nervous system training. And that is what seemed to be healed. So maybe prior to, I'm like days, weeks leading up to getting this opportunity to go to Refuge, I had been noticing myself being easily triggered and suffering neurotically, and with maybe my writing or with different things. But then it gave me a chance to train my nervous system to be grounded and calm, and those things were very healing. And then going from cold tub to hot tub is a wonderful relaxing experience as well. And so it seemed like all of in that neutral space, that meditative space in the cold water, all of those little shivers, a shock of shiver through the body, and me not reacting to it, but just sitting with it and just knowing it, just for 5, 10, 15 minutes, pushing it. That was, it seemed like every shock was healing some little piece of my nervous system. And I was turned on for the next few days after this experience. I was very turned on. I got my business running, got a lot of things going. And I was, a lot of progress in my dissertation, all of these things. But to have a psychosomatic experience of sitting in that neutral, that is all a metaphor. It's an analogy for the transition between hot and cold, and very physically experienced. A really beautiful experience. I think, Greg, I think you'd really like that.
Oh, well, that would be an acquired taste for me, but
it would be an acquired taste. It's a challenge, but are you as the hero on your journey, are you willing to I really love Joseph Campbell had like a hero is willing, would be willing to drop everything and restart again. The idea that you would be somebody makes $1 million. You have $1 million. Well, what would you like to do? Well, I would like to give away my $1 million and start from the bottom all over again just to prove that I could do it, or just to see that I could do it.
There's something to be
I
said
love
for
that
that.
idea. Yeah.
Yeah. You know, this reminds me of your description. It was a beautiful analogy of the hot and cold plunge. I sat in a lecture once by M. Scott Peck. Remember this name?
Yeah.
The Road Less Traveled.
Yeah.
In San Francisco years ago, before he died, of course. And in the Q&A section at the end of the lecture, I raised my hand and stood up and asked him, how will I know in making an important personal decision? How will I know that I'm making the right decision? And he said, there's no such formula. Because the unconscious is always a step ahead of the conscious mind, the one that supposedly knows things. So there's no way to know for sure. But he said, if you're willing to sit with uncertainty and ambiguity, you know, in the cold plunge of that ambivalence, and you're willing to sit there for a while, you'll be in the unconscious portion of the show, the one that knows deeper things, and you'll therefore make the right decision, though you won't actually know it at the time. But I remember just really studying that response of his for a while afterwards, is what does it mean to sit with uncertainty and ambiguity and the discomfort of those for people who want to know stuff. They want to fix things. They want to figure things out. And that was a real challenge. That is a real challenge for me, is the willingness to sit in an uncomfortable place of cold plunge, the emotional or spiritual version of a cold plunge, and you know, and just sit there and watch what happens. Not immediately get out and get into the warm water, but watch what happens inside you while you're in that state. And that's just been a great teaching for me.
Do you experience that in your writing process, sitting in the ambiguity? Like,
oh my God,
in the middle of a book or a paper or an article, what is that like for you? How do you sit with that?
Yeah, all the time, because in writing, what I'm attempting to do is what they call free association writing, where I just let the unconscious go on a roll with a keyboard under its fingers, you know, and I don't know where it's heading me. I don't know, you know, sometimes I get tangled up in knots of logic. And I'm like, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. I've got to back up 3 steps and come at this another angle. It's a very chaotic, organic activity, as any creative act really is. And so I just have to be with that. It's just part of the heavy lifting of being a writer in this case. Really, I think any kind of creative person, just the willingness to sit with the crazy process of that. And I think that's great training for just living a life, because life isn't linear. You know, you ask anybody, how'd you get where you got? And they're not going to describe an A to Z linear path. They're going to describe this. Typically. I think I mentioned this in the class also the other day, is I sat down and did a timeline of the growth spurts in my life, full of chaos. In fact, almost every growth spurt in my life was precipitated by chaos. And so something about making real, genuine friendship with chaos is, I think, is the better part of valor and wisdom on the path.
Yeah. The natural growing pains with that chaotic moment, that chaotic chapter of life, that chaotic transition from it's like maybe the chaos is the turning of the last page of the last chapter and the beginning to the new chapter, and that turning that page is you know, sitting in that is such a challenge. What do you think is I had this question prior to the conversation. I'm wondering for you, since you're such a great writer, what has been maybe the top 3 things that you believe that an aspiring author would need in order to write a book, whether that's good or bad or or all of the above? But what are 3 things that a writer, an aspiring writer, should have? 3 tips? What works for you?
Question. I would say, I'm going to borrow this from a writer in LA named Michael Ventura. And I encourage people to Google him, Ventura, as in Ventura Highway. He calls it the talent of the room. So before any issues of skill and any of the mechanics of writing, you have to address, for how long can you sit alone in a room and write? And so this is really getting at discipline.
Yeah.
And that's such a huge part of being a writer, is sitting alone in a room and writing for hours and days and weeks and months and sometimes years. Yeah. So that, I think, is one of the essentials for a writer, is the talent of the room. And there's a essay he wrote called The Talent of the Room. That's what you should Google, plus Michael Ventura. Let's see. I would say, being a writer, writing from your passions is a great idea. Not that I didn't do a ton of the opposite of that as a reporter, when I was assigned stories and just had to follow them, but I had a natural sense of curiosity, so that helped. But writing from your passions, from your conundrums, from your the problem you were born to understand, your deep mystifications about stuff, your desire to figure it out, come from that place, because then it's going to have a really organic, impassioned tone to it. So that would be another. And also be reading good writing while you're writing. I had a mentor of mine say to me when I was going to be writing my first book, he said, you should be reading poetry while you're writing the book, for the language, he said. And I found that fascinating. In fact, I discovered a little trick to push my own writing into a more creative state, which is that I literally narrowed the margins on the page. So it went from prose style to poetry style. And something about narrowing the margins made it literally look like poetry, and I wrote more that way. And so my language actually became more beautiful to me, and more stylish and more interesting. So a little trick like that, but I reading poetry and reading beautiful writing, and frankly, picking it apart limb from limb. I've done a lot of that in my career. Why is this so beautiful? How did this writer create this sentence, this paragraph, this piece? So studying the hell out of it.
Yeah, I see the poetic influences in your writing. The beautiful adjective language that is being used to describe an idea, and since I had the opportunity to be in workshop with you, the workshop that you facilitated, and I'm even in our conversation now, your ability to grab a quote from memory and those beautiful lines, like the humming of the husband, that line that you mentioned earlier. Do you write those quotes down and memorize them purposefully? Do you is that your picking them apart to figure out how they wrote that line?
Yeah, it is some of that. I think I'm also just blessed with a good memory.
Sure, yeah, that's great.
Comes in really handy, especially as a teacher.
Yeah.
But I think I have a profound respect and soft spot for beautiful writing. For a beautiful turn of phrase. And when I run across one, or a really compelling quote, it goes into a place in me that just holds it close to the surface, so that I can access it. And I think that may be one reason why I just remember these quotes and these turns of phrase.
It makes you a wonderful speaker. It's really important
thank you.
As a speaker to have to be able to speak in quotes in some way. Do you think that Rumi wrote all of Rumi's poems?
Oh, that's a great question. Did Shakespeare write all of Shakespeare's writing?
I tend to believe, like, how much time did this? I guess he lived in a time, or Rumi, whoever Rumi is, lived in a time where they had all the time on their hands. But I tend to believe, like, just the amount of poems that this man, beautiful,
Unbelievable.
beautiful poems that he was able to somehow
Yeah,
to bring from the muse is amazing.
it is amazing. And while we're on some of the subjects we're on, I recommend to people to read one of his poems called The Guest House, which is about, in a sense, is about the cold plunge.
Oh, yeah.
You know, the psychic cold plunge. It's about welcoming whatever shows up.
Mm-hmm.
It's a beautiful poem.
Yeah. Do you want to say more about that? The guest house?
Well, it's, the guest house is just whatever emotion shows up at your front door, open the door, welcome it in, take tea with the demons, as the Buddhists say, and so the poem is just an acknowledgement of whatever shows up, welcome it in. Don't push it away because it's uncomfortable, because it's cold, because it's scary. Campbell used to say this all the time. If you're not afraid of a calling, there's something fishy.
Mm-hmm.
Because
is it your calling if you're not afraid of it?
right. And is it going to push you into a heroic state of being? Because calls, among other things, they call you away from the status quo, especially the bigger ones, sharing your gifts with the world, or things like that. They call you away from the familiar and the comfortable. And that's heroic work all by itself.
Yeah.
That's heroic. In fact, I remember hearing this years ago. Somebody said heroism can be redefined, or I would add heroinism. Heroism can be redefined for the modern age as the ability to tolerate paradox, to hold two seemingly contrary energies inside of you at the same time and still retain the ability to function.
Yeah.
And I just think that's something about heroism that's most people wouldn't think of. I never thought of it, is holding the tension between Democrats and Republicans, right, faith and fear, us and them, the essential self and the socialized self, and just holding them and then bringing them together to talk to one another.
Yeah.
That's heroic work, because
that's what I think transpersonal psychology does well, is the negative capability of holding those paradoxes simultaneously, the practical science of things and the spiritual the spiritualness of Eastern traditions, of spirituality, all kinds of religious and spiritual traditions, and all of the lessons and wisdom that we can gain from those. I've gained a lot from this conversation. This has been really amazing. I do recommend that everybody gets this book, Callings, because I have read it, and it was a required reading. It was amazing, a really great book. And then Vital Signs. This has been out for a little bit now. Are you writing any new books? Are you working on anything right now?
I'm waiting for my next marching orders. It hasn't arrived yet, but the last 2 or 3 years, the pandemic years, have given me a ton of stuff to write about. Yeah. It is such a juicy, profound, global phenomenon. Yeah. And just flushed up a lot of really interesting stuff to write about. I'm looking for the through line in all of what I've written. And most of those writings ended up in my Psychology Today blog. Yeah. So at some point, like I often do, I'll look at everything I've written in the last 5 years and see if there's what the threads are, what the dots are to connect. And sometimes my books grow out of that. But an actual book subject hasn't arrived yet.
That's awesome. Well, I feel like you would be a great person to party with. I feel like we have such a great time. I really appreciate this conversation. Thank you so much for transforming with us today.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I appreciate it, Greg.
Thank you. And thank you for all your questions and your beautiful inquisitiveness.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Wow, that was a great conversation with Gregg Levoy and I. A great way to start off your new year is by getting both of his books, one or both, Callings, Finding and Following an Authentic Life. This is a beautiful book. I've read it a couple of times. And his newer volume, Vital Signs, Discovering and Sustaining Your Passion for Life. Don't those titles sound enticing for your new year, 2023? Let's go. And check out more of the podcast, Gray Transforms. Thank you.